Thanks for the introduction. I'd forgotten some of those things. Is that okay? It seems that. So I'm Josh. Please feel free to call me that and to interact, I'm hoping, during the course of talking tonight. I'm really hoping that this will be a discussion about something that I've intentionally tried to be a little provocative about, meaning is being male a cancer predisposition syndrome. So this is a mandrill. I hope most people recognize the mandrill. It's the most sexually dimorphic of all primates. We are the least sexually dimorphic of primates, and we'll talk a lot about sexual dimorphism, meaning differences between males and females, and why that's so. And I think it probably comes as no surprise to anybody in the room that males and females of virtually every species, there's only a few exceptions, where males are not bigger than females, where males are not more significantly ornamented than females. And the question is why? I mean, why is that so? Anybody? Orangutan males.
Sorry.
That's okay. You know, for the room, do I really need a microphone?
Yes.
Okay. How about if I stood next to you guys? Would I still need a Orangutan males are 4 times the size of females. So think about that in human terms. That would be like my wife being 1.25 feet, or me being like 20 feet tall. I mean, why is there such a big difference? Anybody? Because it's not just primates, right? It's cats, it's these caribou, horses, dogs.
Females have different jobs and they built to do different things.
Okay, males and females have different jobs and they're built to do different things. Can we think about that for a minute? What's so different about the jobs that male and female giraffes do? All right, how about male and female peacocks? Yes?
The males have the little tufty thingies.
This giant tail?
And that's for attracting the females.
Excellent. Okay, so the peacock is ornamented in a way. I'm going to start putting this into the terms that people talk about it. The peacock is ornamented in order to influence the mate choice of the female. So that's a different job, right? The males need to influence mate choice. So contrary to what people have thought commonly for a long time, in most of the animal kingdom, males don't do the choosing. It's the females that do the choosing. And males are ornamented in order to influence that female mate choice. You know that male birds are always the more colorful birds, right? The male mandrill compared to the female mandrill. I mean, this ornamentation is exquisite. It's incredibly colorful. It's visible from far away. The antlers on antlered creatures, and the giant mane of a lion, all of these things are ornaments that are meant to influence female mate choice. So that's definitely a job that's different between males and females throughout the animal kingdom. But what other jobs? Yeah, I can't think of another one either. And that's going to be key. So we're used to all of this. And for everybody in this room, who I suspect is a parent, we're used to this. Why do we need 2 different growth charts for our normal children? I mean, this is all pre-pubertal. Oh no, this is the whole growth chart, sorry. This is all growth. But starting from the time of birth, this one doesn't extend to birth, males are growing differently than females. And we're the least sexually dimorphic of primates. In fact, from the moment of fertilization, male pre-implantation blastocysts grow faster than female pre-implantation blastocysts. They're bigger at the time of implantation, and they have more cells at the time of implantation. And that's true in every placental animal that's been examined, including humans. The first data for that came from the meat industry, because they do everything by in vitro fertilization. So for cows and for sheep and for pigs, they needed methods to screen through the in vitro fertilized blastocysts. That's the name for the aggregate of cells before it implants. They needed to screen through lots of them and pick the ones that were most likely to survive. And when they did that, they determined that they needed to have different sets of values for the male and the female blastocysts. They needed to have different values for how much glucose they were metabolizing. They needed to have different values for how fast they were growing in order to identify the ones that were most likely to live after implantation. Turns out to be true for humans too. That data has only been recent because of the effort to try and reduce the numbers of embryos that are implanted in human in vitro fertilization so that you don't have these multiple gestation pregnancies. And so in screening through those embryos, the exact same thing was found for humans, as it has been for every placental creature. So from the moment of fertilization, males are growing differently than females. And we see that in the use of our growth charts. And if you took a bunch of college-age students, as was done many years ago, as you can tell from the photograph, and you made a histogram with them based on their size, what you would find is that the individuals who are wearing white, who are the females, and the individuals who are wearing black, who are the males, have these two different distributions in body size. And they're actually statistically significantly different. There's a huge overlap. Again, we're the least sexually dimorphic. But there's still a statistical difference between the height of human males and human females. And if you think about the extremes, at the lower end of human height, it's virtually all females, and at the higher end of human height, it's virtually all males. It's not obviously strictly that way, but that is the trend. Any questions about that so far? I realized I just started talking without a... And it's not just height, right? There's lots and lots of human disease that exhibits a tendency to affect one sex versus the other. So while it's a little controversial how big the difference is in autism, right now you can do a search, a Google search, and you'll find 8 to 9 times more likely that a male will have autism than a female. That's true in a family, like the same family, brothers and sisters. That's a remarkable difference. Turns out that that's similar. We actually have the director of the ICTS here. I hope you guys know Chris Gurnett. That's true for a lot of neurodevelopmental disorders. Males are at much higher risk for having clinically significant deficits compared to females. These other things are also more common in males. On the side of the picture with the male orangutan, who's got this giant ornamentation in addition to these ornamentations and his enormous body size. And on this side are those things that are more common in females. Again, they can happen to either sex, but they partition frequently along those lines. So we have evidence for our normal development being very different. And the only thing that we could come up with for why that would be different is the fact that males have to influence this mate choice. Females, of course, have to be adapted for bearing babies and nurturing babies, which males don't have to do, but it's not clear why that would result in a difference in their body size. And in addition to their growth being different, they have different vulnerabilities for common diseases, some of which have clear genetic bases and some of which don't. So how does that come to be? So Darwin actually recognized this. Sorry about that. And in The Origin of the Species, in chapter 4, he has this beautiful quote, I think, that when males and females of any animal have the same general habits of life but differ in structure, color, or ornament, those differences have been mainly caused by sexual selection. Now, the important thing about sexual selection is it runs counter to natural selection. So that giant peacock tail that we were talking about before, how do you think that affects the peacock when a big cat wants to grab it and eat it? I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to be near a full adult male peacock. I got this opportunity because my daughter used to ride horses out west here someplace, I've already forgotten where. But there were woods that I would, that was a half-day event. So I would go hiking in these woods that were nearby. And in the woods were wild peacocks. That this local story was that there had been somebody a very long time ago who had them for walking around their yard, and they had just, established themselves. But, I'll tell you, they can't fly. I mean, it takes like all of their effort to get just a little bit off the ground, and they can't run, and they can't maneuver through the forest very well. It's not a problem to like go right up to them and touch them. So it runs counter to natural selection. That's true for the big antlers too. You think about the predators for antlered animals. It includes big cats and bears, depending on how far you get north. Maybe you're okay in the open field running with those giant things, but running through the woods like a deer with big antlers running through the woods, they can't get away from a cat that's chasing them. So how is it that there are traits that decrease your lifespan? I mean, most people who have studied evolution think about evolution as driving adaptations that increase your lifespan, that make you live longer, live healthier. Here's a set of traits that exist across all of these species that actually preferentially decreases the lifespans of males, not females. And of course, we were just talking about this. So how does this come to be? So there's a very simple math to this. And it has to do with per progeny resource sacrifice. So you're a male of any species. You make millions of sperm through the course of your adult life. If we're talking mammals, you are physically capable every single day of your adult life of impregnating multiple females. You expend no personal resources on the gestation of fetuses and no personal resources on the nurturing of newborns. Your per progeny resource sacrifice is as close to zero as it's possible to be. And you are said to be mate limited in your reproductive success. Females, on the other hand, are born with all the eggs they'll ever have. 1 to a few becomes available for fertilization at any given time. They cannot be impregnated. Once they're impregnated, they cannot be impregnated again until after they've delivered, and for many mammals until after they've finished nursing. So there's a tremendous period of time where they can't reproduce again. They expend all the personal resources on the gestation of fetuses and the nurturing of newborns. Their per progeny resource sacrifice is enormous, and they are said to be resource limited in their reproductive success. This is what drives the difference in the traits, because for males who have to influence female mate choice, to grow large and to be ornamented, and in fact, the more costly the ornament, the more successful males are reproductively. They really have very little value biologically. Sorry, it's true, past the time of reproduction. And so And for females, there is a need to control growth, right? If fetal growth is not controlled, everybody dies. The mother can't keep up with the nutritional needs, particularly in animals that have litters. And if the growth is so fast in newborns, the same thing becomes true. There's a huge resource demand. And if you're nursing babies that are growing too fast, you can't keep up with it. And so this creates conflict, evolutionary conflict, because the males benefit in terms of reproductive success by growing bigger, faster, and being ornamented. The females benefit, increase their reproductive success by being able to control growth. And you see evidence for this from actually even before fertilization. So the early growth that we talked about before, when at fertilization you see male pre-implantation blastocysts metabolizing more glucose, dividing faster, growing bigger. That's driven by a couple of very important growth factors. Possibly the most important of them is something known as insulin-like growth factor 2. So you inherit 2 copies of the insulin growth factor 2 gene, and the maternal copy is silenced. So the only stimulus for growth is coming from the father. There's an antagonist of IGF-2, which is how we talk about insulin-like growth factor 2, known as H19. The paternal H19 is silenced, and so the only inhibition of growth rate actually comes from the mother. So from the very start, even before fertilization, you see this evidence for how males and females differ in their growth regulation. That continues throughout pregnancy in terms of maternal influences and paternal influences on growth. And the evidence for that comes from a couple of sources. The most, rigorously evaluated is the study of the children that were born in 1943 or 4, when the Nazis surrounded Holland, and they basically starved the Dutch population through the course of a winter that's known as the Hunger Winter. For the past 80 years, that population of kids, their kids, and their grandchildren have been extensively studied to understand the consequences of that starvation. The children that were born as a consequence of that starvation included normal numbers of girls, but they were small for gestational age, or small at the time of birth. And it included decreased numbers of boys who were normal in size. And that has been replicated in multiple famine circumstances. There was a big famine in China where that result was replicated, and there's cyclical famines in Africa where you see the same thing. And that leads to this sense of there being sort of a dichotomous logic to growth and stress. In the case of females, the female logic would be to sacrifice growth to maintain viability. For males, it's about sacrificing viability to maintain growth, because in fact, you can't compete if you don't achieve like a normal adult size and your normal ornamentations. For females, you can be a little bit small. I mean, the choice is up to you, right? It's not, the males aren't choosing you, you're choosing the males. And so that kind of logic actually carries over into other diseases. Women who experience preeclampsia, this hypertensive vascular complication to pregnancy, give birth to small baby girls, but don't tend to lose their female pregnancies. But they either lose their male pregnancies or give birth to a male that's more normal in size. Infections, smoking, all kinds of in utero stressors reproduce this kind of data. And so we think about there being two different optimums for growth. There's a female growth optimum and a male growth optimum. And there are mechanisms that have evolved to exert a female influence on growth that decreases it, that silencing of the IGF-2 locus, or a male mechanism that stimulates it, the silencing of the H19. And the question is, what does that matter to a disease of growth like cancer? This is an actual tumor taken out of a human. There's the surgeon's hand. Cancer is a disease of growth. I mean, in its most simplest form. So if males and females grow differently, like, what does that mean for their cancer risks? Well, oh, that was supposed to have done that before, sorry. Here's an interesting story that addresses that question and introduces another important evolutionary concept. Having a little word finding trouble. These are sword tails. People have these in their fish tanks, right? The top one there is a normal-sized adult male sword tail. This is an adult male sword tail as well. Both of these sword tails were caught off the coast of California in a population of wild sword tails that lives there, in which there's somewhere around like 10-15% of the males are this big. These males are very successful reproductively, yet they only comprise like 10-15% of the male population. So why might that be so? We'll skip that and go right to this. It's because 100% of them develop melanoma soon after achieving their adult size, and they die. And so they are really successful at being chosen for reproduction, very early, but then they disappear. And most of the male population does not have the variant in this gene that drives that growth and makes them susceptible to cancer. This is called antagonistic pleiotropy. It's the idea that there's a trait that would be selected for because of its effect on reproductive success. So it works, it was selected for its action early in life, but then it has an unintended consequence that actually results in decreased lifespan. The decreased lifespan is not something for which natural selection can operate. It's just about that reproductive success. And so the gene for this persists in the population. And this would be a cancer predisposition syndrome, right? These males get cancer, and they're born with the risk, and 100% of them get cancer. And so this notion of antagonistic pleiotropy as a basis for cancer risk and the relationship between growth and that cancer risk actually exists in the swordtail population. How about in humans? So I study brain tumors, but what I'm about to say is true actually for almost all cancers. So in general, more males get cancer than females. And in general, they die faster from their cancers than females do. And it's true for almost every kind of cancer, except for those that are truly sex-specific. So ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer. There are males that get breast cancer, but it's a tiny, tiny group of males. If we're talking about all of the cancers that they share, with the exception of cancers in endocrine tissues, which are more common in females, every other cancer is more common in males, and in every other cancer, males tend to die more frequently of their cancer. So here we've got brain tumors, melanoma, bladder, and stomach, just as a sampling. On the x-axis here are ages in 5-year intervals from 20 to greater than 85. And on the y-axis is the rate of cancer per 100,000 individuals. The blue line is males, and the red line is females. And what's interesting, everybody knows cancer risks go up with age, but look at how much faster the risk goes up for males than it does for females. With age, males have an ever-accelerating risk compared to females for developing cancer. Is it possible that that's evidence of antagonistic pleiotropy around growth regulation, just like it was in the swordfish? So we were interested in that question. And we set up a model system. We set up a model system in the lab. This is only one of 2 slides that have lab data on them, I think. It's not. There we go. We set up a model system in the lab to look at this. So we're interested in glioblastoma and medulloblastoma, as you heard before. Glioblastoma is the most common malignant brain tumor. And it occurs preferentially in males. And the closest normal cell to a glioblastoma cell is a brain cell known as an astrocyte. And so we took astrocytes out of mice on the first day they were born. We cultured the male astrocytes in one dish and the female astrocytes in another dish. So they're growing in a dish. There's no sex hormones anywhere. We made sure of that. Whatever their differences are is a consequence of their in utero development. And if anybody wants to talk about the details of that, we can. And then we introduced into them some of the mutations that you would commonly see in glioblastoma as it occurs in humans. And we asked, was it easier to turn a male astrocyte into a glioblastoma cell compared to a female cell? And the answer to that was unequivocally yes. And I'm not going to show you a ton of data, but I'm just going to show you this. We introduced these genetic events, the deletion of a gene known as neurofibromin, and the inactivation of the essential protector of cancer, p53. I don't know if you guys happen to see the article in Time. Yeah, it was Time, the cover article about why elephants don't get cancer. So actually, I'm going to take a minute to talk about this because it's just fun. So it's been considered for a long time, does body size correlate with cancer risk? And within a species, body size does correlate with cancer risk. But across species, there's a bunch of little animals in which their size does correlate with their cancer risk. But then you make a jump to enormous animals like elephants and blue whales, and they don't get any cancer, like none. And that includes familiarity with the zoo populations now, which some zoos have the experience of having baby elephants that, are in their care until they die as old elephants. They don't get cancer. And there was an evolutionary biologist by the name of Peto, P-E-T-O, who described this phenomenon actually quite a long time ago, and it became known as Peto's paradox. How is it possible that you could have enormous animals like elephants and blue whales and that they never get cancer? And the answer to that was just solved a couple of years ago by a friend of mine, the name of Josh Schiffman, and his solution was on the cover of Time magazine. It turns out that elephants have 48 copies compared to our 2 copies of this gene P53, which is really the master protector against cancer. And Pedo had hypothesized that the answer was going to lie in an important gene that protected against cancer. He just had no idea what that gene would be. So anyway, we got rid of that because its function is gone in all malignancies. And then we took the male and the female cells and we implanted them into the flanks of male mice or female mice so that we could determine whether the sex of the recipient mouse mattered. And the only tumors we saw were male cells, except for one exception, regardless of the sex of the animal we implanted them in. You can see this tumor, this tumor, this tumor, this tumor, this tumor, this tumor. There's really only one female tumor. These little bumps are actually this material known as matrigel that we embed the cells in so that they survive. So it's easier to make a cancer in a male cell compared to a female cell. That was true also if we implanted them into the brains of mice. So again, blue are the male cells implanted in both male and female mice, and in red are the female cells implanted into male or female mice. We had engineered them to be green so that we could find them. And when we looked at the tumors that formed in male with male cells and female cells actually looked pretty much identical. So once the female cells formed a tumor, they looked identical. But in every case where an implant of female cells did not kill the animal, we found the cells we had implanted, they just hadn't formed tumors. What did I do? I got to stop touching this thing. So is this related to just the general growth that we were talking about before? And I think it is. I'm going to, this is just one last slide because I want to show you something. One last slide of like complicated stuff. So cell division, one cell becoming two, two becoming four, four becoming eight, is very tightly controlled, right? You don't want to make extra cells. There's no time where you want to make extra cells. But if you need to make a cell, you want to be able to do it. And so there are 4 recognized phases of what's called the cell cycle. There's this resting state where most cells in our bodies sit. There's I think I need to come see you in your office. There's a phase when you make DNA. It's the synthesis phase. There's another break before the cells actually divide. This transition from this G1 to DNA synthesis is the most important with regard to a commitment to growth. There are other checkpoints, as they're called in the cell cycle, but this is the one that's really important for committing to growth. And it's controlled by these 2 proteins, P53, which we just mentioned, and RB, which we haven't mentioned yet. But in the work that we've done to understand those results I just showed you about why the male cells make tumors when the female cells don't, have indicated that both of these proteins are regulated in a different fashion in male versus female cells. At a very fundamental level, the regulation of cellular growth, which of course then contributes to our body size, is different in male and female cells. And what I would, I'm going to go back for a minute. If we think about this, and you think about normal being someplace in the middle, and you think about the first thing that has to happen when you form a cancer, you have to start losing control of growth, right? That's what cancer is all about. So if you're talking about a cell, that means that you're moving this way to higher growth. For a male cell, that's actually moving where you want to be. There's no stimulus to counter-regulate against that. It's where you want it to be. For a female cell, you're further from where you want to be, and there's a big stimulus to counter-regulate against that. And we can actually measure that in cells when we look at those cycles of the cell cycle and the regulators of the cell cycle. So then we finally come back to our question. which I hope we'll discuss. Is being male a cancer predisposition syndrome? So here's a definition of cancer predisposition syndromes. Inherited, you certainly inherit being male. Increases your chances of developing cancer. I think it certainly does that. At an earlier age, that might not be so, although it could be. If you could extend the lifespan even further, you might see that females would ultimately reach that level of cancer that males are reaching in their 50s, 60s, 70s, so it could be true. The thing that isn't true is that cancer predisposition syndromes, so they include things like neurofibromatosis, Lee-Fraumeni, adenomatous polyposis, things that BRCA1, so breast and ovarian cancer, things that you're familiar with. There's a whole long list of cancer predisposition syndromes. But they tend to result in multiple cancers in an individual. That's not so for being male. But being male does affect basically all cancer risk. So in one way, if you weren't thinking about it as something that affected an individual, but affected instead half the population, you might say that, yeah. But I don't know. I'd really like to hear, one, if any of that was sensible, and two, what do you think? Is being male a cancer predisposition syndrome? Can I pick on you, Chris?
I was just going to ask a question about what does the Y chromosome have to do with this? Or does it have anything?
Ah, what an excellent question. So, what does the Y chromosome have to do with this? So, that requires a little discussion of the mechanisms by which males become males and females become females, which I love talking about this. So we can talk about that and come back to the question. So we talked a little bit about the pre-fertilization genetics. That's referred to as imprinting. But at the time of fertilization, you're either male or female, right? You have two X chromosomes or you have an X and a Y. There are times when that doesn't happen normally, but let's just pretend that they don't exist for a moment. And so that means that in contrast to genes that are encoded on all of the other chromosomes, if you're female, you have two copies. If you're male, you have one copy of what's on the X chromosome, and you have one copy of what's on the Y chromosome. There is a portion of the Y chromosome that carries genes that do the same things as what's on the X chromosome. That's called the pseudo-autosomal component of the Y, because it makes the Y and that portion of the X look the same. But there's another part that's called the non-pseudo-autosomal part of the Y, which is just completely different from anything that's on the X. So at the time of fertilization, you have this imprinting and you have a genetic difference that has to do with X and Y gene, we would say dosage. It's really referring to copy. Very soon after fertilization, just a few days in, you have this phenomenon of X inactivation, where most of the X chromosome, the second X chromosome, is turned off so that you re-equilibrate the X chromosome gene dosage, and your differences genetically are just those genes that don't get inactivated on the X and this non-pseudo-autosomal part of the Y. It turns out that some of the genes that escape X inactivation, so genes that females always have more activity from than males do, are really important protectors against cancer. So the first part of the answer to your question is it's nothing on the Y. It's having two X's that exerts a big influence on growth regulation, epigenetics, and cancer risk. But the biggest event in sexual differentiation by far is after the formation of testes in utero, there's the production of a large amount of testosterone for a very brief period of time. That testosterone masculinizes the fetus in a way that's stable then for the rest of that fetus's life. You could, in laboratory animals, we can do this. Humans, we can't. But you could remove the testes or the ovaries on the first day of life, and the animals are still male or female. They're still recognizably male or female. They have different body parts, even though you've taken off the testes or the ovaries, they still have other body parts that are different. And their development is different because that both the genetics and that in utero testosterone has created two completely different kinds of individuals, female individuals and male individuals. When we use those growth charts from the time of birth to puberty, there's no circulating sex hormones. That growth is driven by the events that happened in utero. And the evidence in support of that being the most important thing is that there's a human condition known as androgen insensitivity syndrome, or AIS. It used to be known as testicular feminization syndrome. Testes form normally in an XY individual. Testosterone is made normally, but there's a mutation in the receptor for the testosterone that results in it having no activity. Those individuals who have an X and a Y chromosome are born as normal-looking females. They are not normal females. They actually have testes inside their abdomen that never came down because they didn't have the testosterone action to make them come down. But you don't know that they're not females. In the past, you didn't know until they didn't go through puberty. Now, you might know. But the point is that without that masculinization of testosterone, you are almost a normal female. Now, it does turn out that estrogens are also produced from ovaries and that they have a feminization effect, but it's minor in magnitude compared to the effect of testosterone. So what was your question? Oh, what was on the Y? I got completely lost. There are some genes on the Y that are expressed in all the cells of males, and there are other genes on the Y that are expressed only in their testes. And among the genes that are expressed in all cells in the body are several genes that regulate the activity of other genes. And though that is almost certainly important, it's relatively unexplored, and there's nothing on there that would immediately suggest to you that it's impacting on cancer risk the same way that having two X chromosomes is. When you see the genes, you would naturally ask yourself, oh, this could be doing something. Okay, does that answer your question? It took about 10 minutes, right? Anybody want to tell me whether they think being male is a cancer predisposition syndrome? And you know, the importance of that question is, should we screen for cancers differently in males than we do in females, right? When we know somebody has a cancer predisposition syndrome, we screen for cancers in them very proactively. We don't wait for the cancer to form. Should we screen males differently for cancer than we do females? Yes?
What does the environment have to do with cancer? Because male is more exposed to chemicals and
So that's a great question. It's one that has come up from the first time that data were published about cancer rates being different in males and females. And for those of you that might not have heard, the question is, what contribution do different environmental exposures have to do with this? And certainly in the past, it was not hard to equate some cancers with the jobs that men were doing that women weren't doing. Mesothelioma. Great example, right? I mean, you had to be working in Navy shipyards or, you know, removing asbestos from a building you were demolishing in order to get a significant exposure to asbestos. Those jobs weren't typically performed by women. There are a couple of other examples of that having to do with industrial exposures. But the recognition of environmental carcinogens and regulations to protect workers against them, and the more common employment of men and women in similar jobs has resulted in that as a major contributor being pretty much discounted. It may have been a contributor in the past, but the contribution now seems small, if not non-existent. You certainly would have trouble explaining the brain tumor difference by that mechanism, as you may have trouble explaining some of the other cancer differences. Pancreatic cancer, for instance, much more common in males than it is in females. It's hard to imagine what environmental exposure would drive that. So it's a great question, but I think most of the data would suggest that it's not that big a contributor to the sex difference. That's not to say that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer and bad diet doesn't cause colon cancer and sun exposure doesn't cause melanoma. It's saying the difference between males and females is not about exposure. Yes?
Do we still have a preference for larger males now as we have more sedentary jobs where it doesn't matter as much?
So let me rephrase your question a little bit. So in that, it might not always be true in humans that it's only females making mate choices. I think sometimes human males make mate choices too. Is there the same pressure for that sex difference in body size? The things we're talking about are so recent in terms of evolutionary history. I don't know that we could undo it in this time frame. But what's interesting is there is an increased risk of cancer in males as a function of their size, but not in females. And there are several studies that demonstrated that to be true in select populations. I mean, it's not been done in a population as diverse as the US population. You know, the biggest study was a Scandinavian population. So that was, an entirely northern white population. But in the African American community, there is a variant in the same receptor we were talking about before, the androgen receptor that is mutated and causes that androgen insensitivity syndrome. There's a variant, a polymorphism. You guys familiar with the idea of polymorphisms? Okay. That predisposes them to prostate cancer, but it also increases their size. And so again, the gene is thought to be perpetuated in the population because of the effect it has on growth. The variant is thought to be perpetuated in the population because of its effect on growth in the way that growth influences mate choice, but it's got this antagonistic pleiotropy effect and promotes prostate cancer. There are several studies that have examined the physical qualities in males that makes them more or less attractive to females. They do include height, and they include the depth of voice. That was a recent study that's really interesting because they played the same words to women in a high pitch and in a low pitch, and then asked them to recall the words later. And they more often recalled the words as they were said by the deep voice and hadn't listened to the high voice. It's a male speaking with a high voice or a male speaking with a low voice. And low voices go with size generally in males. The taller a man is, the deeper their voice tends to be. So there is evidence that these things linger in human populations as a consequence of earlier events in evolution. Other questions? Yes?
So with reptiles, there's a thing where it's like hot
Great.
chicks and cool dudes.
Yes.
So the hotter the temperature,
Yes.
the more females, the cooler the temperature, the more males. With climate change, do you foresee that affecting the ratio of that for humans?
Well, no, because humans aren't influenced that same way. Because one of the consequences for the reptiles, which is now reaching a catastrophic level, actually, is that unless you have equal numbers of males and females, you can't generate the next generation. So any extreme in temperature for the reptiles results in a decline in their population pretty rapidly, because it doesn't take time. It's just temperature response, right? So this is resulting in a really rapid decline in reptile populations, like across the board.
Now, what about, I guess, the symptoms of climate change, more drought, that sort of thing, which could lead to more famine, and then how famine leads to...
Well, so experience would suggest that as environmental stressors increase, we'll see decreased numbers of male births, but the males that are born will be more normal in size, and we'll see normal numbers of females. The males are, normal in size. Then we'll see normal numbers of females, but they'll be smaller. Maybe we'll end up like the orangutans. Other questions? Well, thank you very much. Oh, yes, sorry.
Quick question, speaking of cancer, is female cancers more deadly or coming at earlier age than male?
No, male cancers are more deadly.
Oh, really?
Yes. Males tend to die more frequently and die faster of their cancers than females do. Yes?
In transsexuals, is there...
Oh, what a great question. So the question has to do with people who undergo sex change procedures. Is there a shift in their cancer rates? So this has been studied pretty extensively for a benign tumor, so not like the cancers we were talking about, known as meningioma. It's a really common intracranial tumor. And so it wasn't part of the cancer statistics I was talking about before. It's actually more common in women than it is in men. And part of the reason it's more common in women than it is in men is it's responsive to progesterone and can be responsive to estrogen as well. So they're stimulated to grow during the post-pubertal, premenopausal age ranges in women. So individuals who are XY and undergo a sex reassignment get lots of estrogen and progesterone in order to affect the changes that are desired. And so the question was whether, the research question was whether that increased their risk for meningioma. And what was interesting is it doesn't appear to increase their risk. Again, the risk is probably established from the in utero events, not so much the hormone exposure for meningioma. But it did increase the size because they were getting basically a growth factor for their tumors. It's a great question. All great questions. All right, well, thank you very much.